The eviction notice was a flimsy sheet of paper, but it felt as heavy as an anvil in Clara's grease-stained hands. Its stark, black letters swam before her eyes. A verdict delivered without a trial. Final notice to vacate. The words were a death sentence for the life she knew, for the sanctuary of steel and oil that was Ben's bolt and piston. It had been her husband's dream, and now it was her legacy. The only place on earth where the ghost of his laughter still echoed off the cinderblock walls. The scent of motor oil, gasoline, and hot metal wasn't just the smell of her profession. It was the lingering perfume of her marriage, a memory she breathed in every day. Silas Croft stood in the wide-open bay door, a man vacuum-sealed into a suit too crisp and clean for this gritty corner of the city. He looked at the garage not as a place of labor and love, but as a blight, a stubborn stain on the pristine blueprint of his future development. His smile was a thin, bloodless slash in his manicured face, an expression of predatory patience. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth as polished chrome but just as cold. "The deadline was yesterday. I've been more than generous." Clara wiped her hands on an already filthy rag, her knuckles bruised and calloused from a lifetime of wrestling with stubborn bolts and rusted parts. She was a small woman, with strands of gray prematurely woven into her dark ponytail, but her eyes held the steady, unwavering focus of someone who understood the intricate mechanics of how things hold together and how they fall apart. "I just need a little more time, Mr. Croft. Business has been slow, but it'll pick up." Croft let out a soft, condescending chuckle. He took a deliberate step inside, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing on the concrete floor, a floor painted with the history of 1,000 oil spills and fluid leaks. "Time is something you've run out of. This garage, this relic," he gestured dismissively at the vintage tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, at the hulking frame of a half-restored Ford Falcon. "It's an anachronism. I'm putting up a 6-story condominium complex. Glass, steel, a rooftop terrace. Progress," he said the word progress, as if it were a holy scripture, a justification for any cruelty. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, failing engine. The neighbors, usually a quiet but present chorus in the daily life of the block, were conspicuously absent. She could feel their eyes, though, peeking from behind drawn blinds and parted curtains. They were silent observers to her slow-motion execution, their silence a form of passive consent. They pitied her, perhaps, but no one would dare stand up to a man like Croft, a man who moved through the world like he owned it, buying and demolishing lives with the stroke of a pen. She was alone, a solitary mechanic against a tidal wave of capital. "This is my home," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of everything she had. Croft's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of bored irritation. "It's a commercial property on which you are delinquent. Let's not get sentimental." He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket and delicately wiped at an imaginary speck of dust on his sleeve. "I'll have my men here in the morning to begin clearing it out. Be gone by then. It will be less unpleasant for you." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating as exhaust fumes. He turned and walked away, his silhouette shrinking against the bright afternoon sun, leaving Clara standing in the cool, familiar darkness of her garage, the eviction notice trembling in her hand like a dying leaf. The world had judged her, dismissed her, and found her wanting. The next morning, Croft returned, not alone. He brought with him 2 men who seemed carved from a block of pure indifference. They were large, with thick arms and the kind of vacant expressions that suggested they were paid not to think, only to act. They flanked Croft like a pair of gargoyles, their presence a blunt instrument of intimidation. Behind them, idling at the curb, was a large, dented moving truck, its empty cargo bay yawning like a grave waiting to be filled. The air, usually filled with the sounds of birds and distant traffic, was tense and still. "Clara," Croft announced, his voice echoing with false bonhomie in the cavernous space of the garage. "I see you haven't started packing." Disappointing, he ran a finger along the dusty fender of the Falcon, leaving a clean streak in his wake. "No matter. My associates will help you expedite the process. The two men stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding on the concrete. One of them grabbed a heavy wrench set, its metal case clattering as he carelessly lifted it. "Where do you want this stuff, boss?" he grunted, his gaze sweeping over the meticulously organized tools with blatant disrespect. Clara's body went rigid. Every tool in this garage had a place, a purpose. Ben had taught her that a disorganized workspace was a disorganized mind. To see them handled like junk, like meaningless clutter, was a physical blow. "Put that down," she ordered, her voice sharper and louder than she intended. It held a tremor, but it was the tremor of a high-tension wire, not of fear. Croft smirked. "Feisty. I admire that. But it's misplaced," he nodded to his men. "Start with the big stuff. Get that car frame out of here. Sell it for scrap." The Falcon was more than a project. It was the last thing she and Ben had worked on together. His fingerprints were metaphorically all over its chassis, his vision for its restoration a blueprint in her mind. The thought of it being crushed into a cube of meaningless metal sent a surge of hot, defiant anger through her veins. She moved, placing her small frame between the men and the car. "You will not touch it." The confrontation was now public. Mrs. Gable from across the street was pretending to water her petunias, her eyes wide. Old Mr. Henderson, who had lived on the block for 50 years, stood on his porch, his hands clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but his wife tugged at his sleeve, her expression fearful, and he fell silent. The community was a gallery of statues, frozen by a shared sense of impotence. They were witnesses, not participants. One of Croft's men laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Look at this. The little lady wants to play tough." He reached out to shove her aside, his hand a meaty slab of flesh. "Don't," Clara warned, her eyes locking onto his. There was no strategy in her mind, no plan of action. There was only a raw, primal instinct to protect this last piece of her husband, this final bastion of her life. The man hesitated, momentarily thrown by the sheer force of her will. Croft sighed, the picture of theatrical exasperation. "This is becoming tiresome. You are a mechanic, a glorified grease monkey, in a failing business in a part of town I am about to gentrify into oblivion. You have no money, no influence, and as you can see—" He gestured to the silent, watching houses. "No support. Your dignity is all you have left. I suggest you use it to walk away." The humiliation was complete. He had stripped her down in front of her neighbors, labeling her as worthless and alone, a forgotten cog in a machine that was grinding her into dust. Later that night, long after Croft and his sneering entourage had departed with a final warning, the garage was plunged into a profound silence. The single bare bulb hanging from the rafters cast long, distorted shadows that danced like specters on the walls. Clara sat on an overturned bucket, the cold plastic biting into her legs. The air was thick with the ghosts of the day's conflict, the lingering scent of Croft's cloying cologne, the phantom echo of his condescending laughter. In her hands, she held a small, dog-eared photograph, its corners softened by years of touch. It was a picture of her and Ben, taken a decade ago in this very garage. They were both covered in grease, smiling, Ben's arm wrapped securely around her shoulder. He looked proud. He was always so proud of her. Her mind drifted back, pulled into the warm currents of memory. She remembered the early days, when she had been hesitant, intimidated by the sheer complexity of a combustion engine. Ben had been endlessly patient. "Don't just look at it, Clara," he would say, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Listen to it. Every engine tells a story. You just have to learn the language." He would guide her hands, his rough, calloused fingers teaching hers the delicate art of diagnosis. He taught her the difference between the sound of a worn bearing and a sticky valve, the subtle vibration of a misfiring spark plug, the specific smell of an electrical short. He hadn't just taught her a trade. He had gifted her a new way of perceiving the world, a language of mechanics and motion. This garage was the cathedral of that shared language. Every tool hanging on its pegboard outline was a verse, every stored part a chapter. The heavy chain hoist in the center of the bay was where they had pulled the engine from the Falcon, their hands working in tandem, a seamless dance of shared knowledge. The workbench, its surface scarred with cuts and burns, was where he had shown her how to rebuild a carburetor, his head bent close to hers, his breath warm against her cheek. Losing the garage wasn't just losing a building or a business. It was like having those memories surgically excised, leaving a hollow void where the heart of her life used to be. The promise she had made to him on his deathbed echoed in the quiet space. He had been so weak, his hands, once so strong and capable, lying still on the white hospital sheets. "Keep the doors open, Clara," he had whispered, his voice raspy. "Don't let the music die." He called the sound of a well-tuned engine the music. It was his symphony, and he had made her its conductor. She had promised. It was a sacred vow, whispered in the face of grief, and it had become the bedrock of her existence. That promise was the source of her quiet strength, the reason she couldn't simply walk away as Croft had suggested. It wasn't stubbornness. It was honor. It was a refusal to let the last note of Ben's music fade into silence. She stood up, her joints aching from the tension of the day. She ran a hand over the cool metal of the Falcon's fender. Tomorrow was the final deadline. Croft would be back, and this time, he wouldn't leave without destroying everything. A wave of hopelessness washed over her, cold and vast as a winter ocean. But then, she looked at the photograph again, at Ben's smiling, confident face. The hopelessness receded, replaced by a single, hard kernel of resolve. She didn't know how, but she would not break her promise. The pressure mounted with the ticking of the old wall clock, each second a hammer blow against the fragile shield of her composure. Tomorrow morning, her world would end. She walked to the small, dented cash box she kept hidden under the counter. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside lay a pathetic collection of crumpled bills and loose change. $47.53. Not enough to stop an avalanche. Not enough to buy a single day's grace. It was the sum total of her worldly assets, the final, insulting punctuation mark on a life of hard work. Outside, a storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain began to fall, first as a gentle patter on the corrugated metal roof, then escalating into a torrential downpour, a furious, cleansing roar. It mirrored the tempest inside her, a storm of fear, anger, and crushing despair. It was through this curtain of sound, a wall of water and wind, that a new noise struggled to be heard. A sputtering, coughing, choked sound. The unmistakable death rattle of a failing engine. It grew louder, closer, punctuated by a loud backfire that cracked like a gunshot, and then silence. Only the drumming of the rain remained. Clara peered through the rain-streaked glass of the garage door window. A single, dim headlight pierced the gloom. The silhouette was unmistakable. A lone motorcycle, pulled over just at the edge of her driveway. A figure was hunched over it, a giant of a man made larger by the shadows and the rain. Hesitantly, she pushed the heavy bay door up a few feet, the rain immediately misting her face and clothes. The man looked up, his face illuminated by the weak light spilling from the garage. He was immense, with a beard thick and wild, braided with small metallic rings. A soaked leather vest, adorned with patches she couldn't quite make out, clung to his broad shoulders. His face was a testament to a hard-lived life, etched with lines of exhaustion and frustration. The bike was a classic, a vintage Harley-Davidson panhead, a machine that was itself a piece of history. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," the man rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "She just died on me." He gestured to the silent motorcycle with a sort of weary affection. "Don't suppose you're open." Clara's first instinct, born of a day of threats and a night of despair, was to say no, to close the door and retreat into her misery. But then she looked closer. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, the genuine exhaustion in his eyes. She saw the bike, a magnificent, old beast clearly loved and cared for, now sitting wounded and silent. In him she didn't see a threat. She saw a fellow traveler on a road that had just turned rough, a kindred spirit stranded in a storm. And she, more than anyone, knew what that felt like. The pressure of her own problems was immense, a physical weight on her shoulders, but his plight was immediate, tangible. He was stuck, and she had the means to unstick him. "Pull it in," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the sound of the rain. "Let's take a look." He looked at her, surprised. Then a flicker of immense gratitude crossed his face. With a strength that seemed effortless, he pushed the heavy bike through the mud and water, rolling it into the dry, well-lit sanctuary of the garage. The pressure of her own impending doom was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was joined by something else, a sense of purpose. Problem had presented itself, and solving problems was what she did. Clara stared at her own desperate situation, reflected in the puddle of rainwater growing around the biker's boots. $47 stood between her and homelessness. The morning would bring Croft and his wrecking crew. Every rational thought screamed at her to shut the door, preserve her energy, and face her own execution with what little dignity she had left. Yet she couldn't. Looking at the stranded biker and his magnificent, broken machine, she saw not an inconvenience, but a duty. It was the mechanic's code, the one Ben had lived by. You don't leave a rider stranded. Not ever. "Get yourself dry," she told the man, gesturing toward a rickety chair near a small, space heater she just switched on. "I'll see what she's telling me." The biker nodded, his gratitude palpable. He took off his soaked leather vest and hung it carefully on the back of the chair. The patches were now visible, Hell's Angels. A jolt of apprehension went through her, but it was quickly overridden by the problem at hand. The bike was the focus. She spent the next hour in deep diagnostic conversation with the panhead. Her hands, small and nimble, moved with an expert's grace, checking the plugs, the fuel line, the wiring. The biker, who introduced himself only as Preacher, watched her, his initial skepticism melting into quiet admiration. He saw she wasn't just a part swapper. She was a true diagnostician, a machine whisperer. The problem, she eventually discovered, was deep in the guts of the engine. A catastrophic failure in the magneto, the heart of the ignition system. It was a complex and delicate piece of equipment, especially on a vintage model like this. "It's shot," she announced, holding up the fried component. "Completely burned out." Preacher let out a long, weary sigh. "Figured it was something bad. I don't suppose you have one of these just lying around." It was a rhetorical question. A magneto for a 48 panhead wasn't something you could pick up at the local auto parts store. Clara hesitated. Her gaze drifted to a small, wooden box tucked away on a high shelf. It was her emergency stash, a collection of rare, vintage parts she and Ben had collected over the years. They were her nest egg, her in-case-of-fire, break-glass assets. Inside that box was a fully restored, period-correct magneto, a part worth hundreds, maybe even $1,000 to the right collector. Selling it was one of the desperate options she had considered to pay off Croft. She looked at Preacher, who was staring at his silent bike with a look of profound loss. She looked at the $47 in her cash box. Then she looked at the photo of Ben on the wall. What would he do? The answer was immediate and absolute. He would fix the bike. Without a word, she climbed the ladder, retrieved the wooden box, and opened it. The magneto sat nestled in soft cloth, a piece of mechanical art. Preacher's eyes widened as he saw it. I can't pay you for that," he said, his voice heavy with honesty. "Not right now. I'm broke until I get to my chapter in Portland. I can send you the money. I give you my word." Clara just shook her head. She was already at the workbench, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She brewed a pot of coffee, the last of her grounds, and made 2 thick sandwiches with the last of her bread and cold cuts. She handed one to Preacher. For the rest of the night, under the lonely glare of the garage light, she worked. She meticulously disassembled the old housing, fitted the new magneto, and retimed the entire engine. It was a delicate, painstaking process. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. She was finished. She wiped her hands and nodded to Preacher. "Try it now." He swung a leg over the bike, his face a mask of hope and trepidation. He kicked the starter. The engine, which had been silent and dead for hours, exploded into life with a deep, throaty, perfectly timed roar. It was a sound of resurrection, a symphony of controlled power. The music was back. A slow, wide smile spread across Preacher's face. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a level of respect that bordered on awe. "What do I owe you?" he asked, his voice full of genuine emotion. Clara simply shook her head, a faint, tired smile on her own face. "Get where you're going," she said. That's all. It was an act of pure, selfless sacrifice. She had given away her last valuable asset, her last bit of energy, to a stranger, with her own world about to be demolished. She had chosen honor over survival. As the sun climbed higher, casting long morning shadows across the block, Silas Croft's gleaming black sedan pulled up to the curb, a predator returning to its kill. The two hulking men from the day before got out, their expressions bored and ready for business. The large moving truck rumbled to a stop behind them, its diesel engine a low, menacing growl. This was it, the final act. But something was different this morning. The street wasn't empty. Mrs. Gable was on her porch, not pretending to water plants, but watching openly, her face etched with concern. Mr. Henderson stood beside her, his arms crossed, his jaw set in a line of grim disapproval. A few other neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the grim certainty of the unfolding drama. They had seen the lone biker arrive in the storm. They had seen the garage light burning all through the night, a solitary beacon of defiance. They had heard the powerful roar of the resurrected motorcycle engine at dawn and watched the massive biker ride away, not with a roar of aggression, but with a respectful nod back toward the garage. Their silent judgment from the day before had curdled into something else. The whispers that passed between them were no longer about Clara's foolish stubbornness, but about her inexplicable resilience. They saw a woman who, on the eve of her own destruction, had chosen to spend her last hours helping a stranger. It was an act so contrary to the logic of self-preservation that it commanded a new, grudging respect. They didn't understand it, but they recognized its power. The narrative had begun to shift. Clara was no longer just a victim. She was a quiet warrior, making her last stand not with weapons, but with an act of incomprehensible grace. Croft stepped out of his car, radiating smug triumph. He adjusted his silk tie and strode toward the garage, his footsteps echoing in the charged silence. "Well, Clara," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "The clock has struck 0. Time's up, sweetheart." He gestured for his men to move forward, to begin the dismantling of her life. It was at that precise moment that the sound began. It was low at first, a distant, almost subsonic vibration that you felt in your bones before you heard with your ears. It wasn't the sound of the moving truck or a passing plane. It was deeper, more primal. Croft paused, a flicker of annoyance on his face. The neighbors looked down the street, their expressions turning from concern to confusion. The rumble grew steadily, multiplying, layering on top of itself until it became a physical presence, a ground-shaking roar that rattled the windows in their frames. It was the sound of an approaching army, a mechanized horde. Then they appeared. First one, then two, then a dozen headlights crested the small hill at the end of the block. They weren't cars. They were motorcycles, a flowing river of chrome and black leather, flooding the residential street. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their engines thundering in a synchronized, deafening chorus. They were Hell's Angels, hundreds of them. The sheer number was overwhelming, a tidal wave of intimidation. They flowed into the area, completely blocking the street from both ends. They formed a silent, intimidating semicircle around Ben's bolt and piston, their bikes creating an impenetrable wall of steel. The moving truck and Croft's sedan were trapped inside the cordon. The engines fell silent in unison. A sudden, shocking quiet that was somehow more menacing than the noise. In the center of the front line, on a vintage panhead that now gleamed and purred like a contented panther, was Preacher. He swung his leg off the bike, his massive frame seeming to block out the sun. He walked forward, his boots heavy on the asphalt, the crowd of bikers parting for him like the Red Sea. He didn't even glance at Croft. His eyes were fixed on Clara, who stood, stunned and bewildered, in the mouth of her garage. The Brotherhood had arrived. Preacher walked past Silas Croft as if he were nothing more than a piece of street debris, his focus entirely on Clara. He stopped a few feet from her, his sheer size and the weight of the 200 silent bikers behind him creating an almost unbearable intensity. The air was thick with the smell of leather, exhaust, and ozone. Croft, for the first time, looked uncertain, his smug confidence rapidly evaporating in the face of this silent, leather-clad army. "Ma'am," Preacher said, his deep voice carrying across the silent street, imbued with a profound, almost formal respect. He unhooked a small, worn leather pouch from his belt. "You gave me something last night when I had nothing. You asked for nothing in return." He looked from Clara to the crowd of bikers, then to the watching neighbors, and finally, his gaze fell upon Croft with chilling contempt. "This woman," he boomed, his voice a thunderclap that made Croft flinch, "doesn't just fix machines. She understands honor. A concept men like you," he jabbed a thick finger in Croft's direction, "couldn't possibly comprehend." He turned his attention back to Clara. "That bike you saved," he continued, his voice softening slightly, "wasn't just any bike. It belonged to my father. He founded our charter on that panhead 50 years ago. I was on a pilgrimage, riding his last route to honor the anniversary of his passing. When it broke down, it felt like I had failed him." He paused, the emotion raw in his voice. "You didn't just fix an engine. You restored a piece of our soul. You honored my father's memory." He held up the leather pouch. "The Hell's Angels pay their debts." Then he looked directly at Croft, his eyes hardening into chips of granite. "And we protect our own." The statement hung in the air, a clear, unambiguous declaration. A murmur went through the assembled bikers. The truth of the situation rippled through the crowd of neighbors, their dawning comprehension visible on their faces. This wasn't a random act of kindness repaid. It was the salvation of a sacred object, an act of unwitting reverence that had earned the unyielding loyalty of one of the most formidable brotherhoods on the planet. Preacher's identity as the national president was unspoken, but the deference from the men behind him made it clear. This was not just a chapter. This was the heart of the organization, and Clara, through her simple, selfless act, had become sacred to them. The power dynamic on the street had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The developer with all his money and influence was now the most powerless man on the block. Preacher took a step toward Croft, who had gone pale, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The two thugs he had brought with him were frozen, their tough guy facades melted away, revealing the terrified men underneath. They seemed to shrink, trying to make themselves invisible under the collective gaze of 200 bikers. Preacher didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The menace was in his stillness. "You wanted her out," he said, the words low and dangerous. "You wanted this land." He then unfastened a heavy canvas duffel bag from the back of his bike and tossed it at Croft's feet. It landed with a solid, heavy thud. "Consider it sold. To us." Croft stared at the bag as if it were a venomous snake. "The property isn't for sale," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "Everything is for sale," Preacher corrected him. He nudged the bag with the toe of his boot. "That's payment for this garage, and the empty lot next to it, and a community improvement tax. You will take it and you will transfer the deeds. Or—" He let the word hang in the air, pregnant with unspoken consequences. "You can discuss the matter further with our treasurer. He's very persuasive." He gestured to a particularly fearsome-looking biker with a scarred face and no neck, who cracked his knuckles with a sound like breaking branches. Terrified, Croft fumbled with the zipper on the duffel bag. He opened it and his eyes went wide. It was filled with stacks of cash, more money than he had probably ever seen in one place. It was a crude, powerful display of a different kind of wealth, a different kind of power. Preacher turned his back on him. The matter settled. He faced Clara. "This garage is now under our protection," he declared loudly, for all to hear. He gave a sharp nod to his men. A transformation began. The bikers dismounted. They moved with a surprising, disciplined purpose. Some formed a protective perimeter, their presence a clear do-not-cross line. Others, pulling tool belts and equipment from their saddlebags, began to assess the garage. They were carpenters, electricians, welders, a legion of skilled tradesmen hidden beneath the leather and patches. "We're making some upgrades," Preacher explained to a stunned Clara. One of the bikers, a man with silver hair and kind eyes, approached her. He held a brand-new, black leather vest. It was clean, unadorned, except for a single custom-made patch sewn over the heart. It was a beautifully embroidered piston and a wrench crossed over each other. Underneath it, in stark white letters, were the words, "Iron Angel." He held it out to her. "Welcome to the family," he said softly. It wasn't a patch of ownership, but a badge of honor, a symbol that this woman and this place were now part of their brotherhood, a sanctuary they would defend to the last man. The community watched, breathless and awestruck, as the dismissed, forgotten mechanic was publicly, powerfully, and unequivocally recognized. In the weeks that followed, Ben's bolt and piston underwent a resurrection that mirrored the one performed on Preacher's panhead. The quiet, residential street became a hive of constant, productive activity. The roar of engines was now a daily soundtrack, but it was no longer menacing. It was the sound of construction, of reinforcement, of a brotherhood at work. The bikers descended on the garage like a master craftsman's army. The flimsy, corrugated roof was torn off and replaced with heavy-gauge steel. The old, cracked concrete floor was resurfaced and sealed, gleaming under new, bright LED lighting. The walls were reinforced, the wiring was redone, and the aging plumbing was replaced. They didn't just repair the garage. They fortified it, turning it from a simple workshop into a fortress of loyalty. A professional painter among them, a man known as Sketch, spent a week on a mural that covered the entire back wall. It was a stunning piece of art, depicting a classic engine with angel wings, its pistons firing with celestial light. Subtly, almost hidden within the design, was the Hell's Angels' death head insignia, a quiet but permanent claim of territory. The garage was renamed. A new, hand-carved wooden sign hung above the bay doors, Iron Angel Garage. Clara, at first overwhelmed, soon found her rhythm amidst the controlled chaos. She directed the work, her deep knowledge of what a perfect garage needed guiding their efforts. They listened to her with a respect and deference that startled her, treating her expertise as gospel. Business, paradoxically, had never been better. Bikers from charters hundreds of miles away began making pilgrimages to the Iron Angel Garage, seeking out the woman who had unknowingly honored their president. They came for a tune-up, an oil change, or just to buy a t-shirt and shake her hand. Her cash box was never empty again. Silas Croft was never seen on the block again. The deeds were transferred, the money was accepted, and he and his development plans vanished from the neighborhood like a bad dream. The for sale signs on the adjacent properties were replaced by signs that read, "Future site of the Iron Angel Community Center," funded and built by the Bikers Union tradesmen. The community, once silent and fearful, was transformed. The bikers, initially a source of apprehension, became a part of the neighborhood. They were respectful, quiet, and less spoken to, and their presence had an ancillary benefit. Crime on the block dropped to zero. Mr. Henderson now shared morning coffee with a biker named Grizz, discussing gardening. Mrs. Gable baked pies for the work crews. The fear had been replaced by a deep, abiding respect. The final image of this transformation settled one cool evening as the sun bled across the horizon in hues of orange and deep violet. Clara stood at the entrance of her new garage, wiping her hands on a clean rag. The place was immaculate, a testament to shared labor and fierce loyalty. A line of a dozen motorcycles was parked out front, a silent, rotating honor guard that was always present. Their riders stood nearby, talking quietly, their presence not a threat, but a promise. As she prepared to lock up, the low, synchronized rumble of their engines starting filled the air. It was no longer a sound of intimidation or aggression. It was a lullaby of protection, the music of an unshakable brotherhood. Clara placed a hand on the new, sturdy steel doorframe of her garage, feeling the cool, solid strength beneath her palm. A quiet, genuine smile touched her lips. Her husband's music was alive and well, and it had become the anthem for a whole new family. She was not alone. She was home, and she was respected.